Good morning. Well, welcome to church. That's kind of challenging, isn't it? That DVD. I love church. Hands up if you love church. Hands up. Hey, we all love church, and I'm glad we're here because we love church. I tell you, over the last few months, I've been rediscovering my passion for church. And I've been reading about and learning about and praying about what church ought to be, what Jesus' vision of church was. And I've been reading the Word. And so this morning is really just about me sharing this kind of newfound passion that I've been discovering for church, and hoping that you maybe can catch on to this and maybe open up your heart and hear this morning what God might be saying to you about what church is all about. I have wonderful memories of church. I grew up in church, when I was a kid, and I've got some photos just to kind of make it real. But that's me looking rapt to go to church. I remember when we used to go to church, we used to love dressing up. I remember I kind of remember feeling really excited about putting on different clothes for church. You know, I remember we had church shirt and church trousers and church shoes, and so that's me getting ready to go to church. Church for me was a place where a lot of firsts happened. I remember having a birthday in church for the first time in kindergarten, I think it was, that we called it at the time. I remember singing in church for the first time, and here's a photo of us. That's us singing in church and doing our thing. I can remember having first disasters in church. I remember playing my trumpet in church for the first time. It was a disaster. I remember, I had like a month to prepare, and I had the song all sorted out, and I was 10 years old, and my dad had my trumpet, and, he was keeping it warm so that as soon as I blew that first note, it would just be amazing. And I remember standing up in front of church and trying to blow that first note, and nothing came out. Nothing, seriously nothing. So I tried it again, nothing. And I think I stood there for about 3 minutes and nothing came out. It was terrible. I remember being embarrassed in front of church for the first time. I remember going to Pathfinders at the age of 9 3/4, not 10. See, this was a big deal. If you could get into Pathfinders earlier, then that was something special. I remember getting to Pathfinders at the age of 9 3/4 and thinking, man, this is really cool. I remember having a crush at the age of 5 on the pastor's daughter, and I think her name was Laura, and she was like 18 and I was 5, and I couldn't understand why she wasn't picking up on my signals. I mean, I was trying to be obvious, but I remember all these things, these great memories of church. I remember speaking in church for the first time, which wasn't actually in front of people, it was out the back, and they had rigged me up with a mic, and my job was to read a Bible text. And I remember young people were taking the church sermon, and my job was to read the Bible text, but I couldn't see anybody. We didn't have fancy stuff where we could see what was going out the back. And I remember I had to time my Bible readings so that I could give people time to turn the pages. And I remember my, whoever it was guiding us said, man, you've got to wait for like 10 seconds and then read the Bible verse. And I remember coming out of that later and them congratulating me that I'd done exactly 10 seconds. I remember feeling good about speaking in church for the first time. I remember church socials. I remember going to church to watch movies. And back then, the movies were on reels. Do you remember? Who remembers reels, movie reels? And they'd set them up and you hear the tick, 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 tick sound, and the movie would play. It's so exciting. I remember, hanging out the back there with my mates and watching these movies at church. I remember church as a place that you went to get your experiences. As a matter of fact, some people say that you can be so attached to your church that, and if you think about it, this can happen. You can be hatched in church, you can be matched in church, and you can be dispatched in church. All in the same place, man, all in the same location. And I think about that, and I think of my wonderful memories of church. But as wonderful as it was, I do wonder that if this is what Jesus had in mind, when he predicted us in Matthew chapter 16. And if you've been coming to church for some time, I wonder if you've ever wondered if church as we do it is the church that Jesus had in mind. For me, I've seen snippets of Jesus' vision for church. In my time in church, I've seen flashes of it. And as I've come to Papsda, I've got to say, those snippets have become visions. Those flashes have been broadened to being longer and deeper exposures to Jesus' vision for church. I love how, at Papsda, how accepting we are. I love how we strive to model compassion without compromise. We strive for that. I love how we endeavor to invert the top-down model of leadership because of our belief that all followers, all of you, everybody who comes into this location are pastors. I love how we do that. I love how we meet in dozens of homes during the week because we believe that wherever Jesus is preached and believed, the church is happening. But I also wonder where Papsda sits when we are placed beside the red-hot vision for church that Jesus shared in Matthew 16. If you're a visitor here this morning, I just want you to imagine that you're sitting in on an in-house thing where we're talking about our church here, Papsda, that we know and love and that we come to. And if you're a visitor here this morning, I want you to be thinking, whatever church you come from, or if you've come from a church, or maybe you've just walked in here and you're looking for Jesus Christ, I want you to be listening into our little talk this morning about Papatoe and church and the purpose that God has for us. Where does Papsda sit? Well, Matthew 16, verse 18 says this, and I wonder if we have. Yes, we do. Just a little bit of background. Jesus is walking with his disciples. They're going to a place called Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus has done some pretty amazing things, and everybody's talking about who they think Jesus is. What we're going to understand is Jesus was the leader of this fringe group who were proclaiming something confusing about a kingdom that wasn't actually attached to this earth. And he was doing miracles and he was doing great things. He was telling parables that people couldn't understand, but they were pretty intriguing. And people were trying to guess about who Jesus was. And Jesus turns to his disciples and he asks them, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter says that, you are the Messiah, you are the Son of God. And in response, Jesus prophesies this about us, actually. He says, "Now I say to you," and he's talking to Peter, "that you are Peter," which means rock, "and upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it." Now, what is this powers of hell? Hey, just to take a shortcut, if you look at the word hell, in the Greek it's Hades, in Jewish it's Gehenna. What they're all referring to is death. What Jesus is saying is that all of us, everything that has ever lived, humans, animals, everything that has ever lived, we live for a while, but then we come up against these gates. And these gates are called death, and no one, no emperor, no organization, no business, no powerful authority, no one has ever smashed open or been able to unlock these gates of death. But Jesus says, when he predicts us, he says, "I will build my church, and all the powers of death will not be able to keep my church out." Will not be able to keep it out. He's talking about us. In other words, death stops everything except the church, everything except us. I don't know how you feel about that. I don't know if you feel that powerful as a church. That you're so powerful that not even the gates of death can hold you in. Church History 101. Because I want to remind you what we're a part of. I've had to remind myself recently what I'm a part of. You know what we're a part of? It's something kind of crazy, really. There's this nondescript carpenter who runs a pretty red-hot ministry for like 3 years. And it's fringe, like it's really fringe. And if we had CNN, you'd probably be starting to see this guy, Jesus, this carpenter, saying these amazing things that nobody's ever said before, rumors that he's been raising people from the dead, that he can heal people, and calling himself a Messiah. And if I was watching CNN, I'd be like, oh yeah, here's another one. Here's another crazy dude going around, like we do today, don't we? Here's another crazy dude going around saying that he's the Messiah. And then something happens. As the leaders of these crazy movements, this happens to them mostly, they get arrested for doing something illegal. In this case, it was treason. Jesus is arrested for treason, and he's executed. And we all go, and everybody who's watching go, yeah, well, we thought that would happen. This happens to all these movements. And right then and there, it should have died, but it didn't. His followers, who are hiding and scared, come out one day, and they hit the streets, not with the teachings of this guy, not with his wonderful teachings, but with an event. They hit the streets with the story of an event. They don't hit the streets going, hey, there's these awesome teachings, which is what makes Christianity different to any other movement. Every other movement is brought up by someone who has great teachings. But Christianity is a movement that was not based on teachings, but based on an event that happened. And the event was that this leader that got killed was raised from the dead, and now he's living. Well, that's crazy. Well, that shouldn't have survived. But here they are, running around telling the story with such passion that they're claiming that they've eaten with him, that they've spoken with him, that they've seen him. And they hit the streets with this eyewitness account of an event. And in the beginning, this thing that we call church was this loose, messy arrangement that had a laser-focused message and a world mission. The story of the global expansion of the church is fascinating. Actually, when you think about it, it's kind of unexplainable. From a purely secular viewpoint, there's no reason why this movement should have even been anywhere near successful. The leader of this movement, Jesus Christ, when people wanted to follow him, he'd say crazy things. There's a time, and you can read it in John chapter 6, where there's hundreds of people ready to lay their life on the line for this new movement. Some of them are really, really influential. And if you're trying to start a movement, you want influential people. You want people that are connected. And all these kind of influential, connected people say to Jesus, we're going to follow you because we believe in your movement. You know what Jesus says to them? Oh, if it was me, I would have said, hey, come on, I'll show you where you can sign up, and here's the plan that we can, how we can grow, and here's my vision, here's my strategy. Jesus says this, listen, if you want to participate in my kingdom, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. They're like, whoa, see you later. So someone else comes up to Jesus and says, hey, listen, it's a young man, and he says, I really want to follow you. I'm going to follow you. And Jesus says, cool, follow me. And the young man says, look, my dad has just died. He's just died. Let me go and bury him, and I'll catch up with you. You know what Jesus says? I mean, I would have thought Jesus might say something like, well, when's the funeral? I'll come and I'll just be there for you, because that's what we would do. Jesus says, you know what he says? He says, you know what, young man? Let the dead bury the dead. Let the dead bury the dead. You come follow me. Another man comes up to Jesus, and he says, listen, I want to follow you. And Jesus says, okay, cool, come, follow me. And the guy goes, excellent, I'm going to leave my family. I'm going to leave my job. I'm going to lose my status, but I don't care. I believe what you say. I'm going to follow you. Jesus says, cool, follow me. And the man says, okay, so what's the tour itinerary and what's the accommodation plan? Well, Jesus goes, accommodation? Oh, no. I don't have an accommodation plan. As a matter of fact, foxes and birds have better accommodation than me. So let's go. And this guy's like, see ya. See ya. It doesn't make sense from a secular viewpoint how we get to have a situation where this fringe thing built to where a third of the population of our world are worshipping this nondescript carpenter. Where this church is built on every every continent on this planet. It just doesn't make sense. And then there's resistance from Rome and from the Jewish authorities. These people call themselves the Way. And And these original members of this organization called the Way, this loose thing with a razor-sharp vision called the Way, as they were persecuted and scattered, it should have died. When the leaders, the ones who eyewitness events of Jesus raising from the dead, when they were gone, this movement should have died, but it didn't. More and more people believed that this was true. More and more people understood that these people who were talking about this event, this raising of Jesus from the dead, see, nobody dies for a lie. If it's a lie, you don't die for a lie. I mean, you don't do that. But these people were dying with this story, and people were believing them. And in a relatively short space of time, this Jewish knockoff religion replaced the entire Roman pagan belief system. It doesn't make sense. But the story of the church is not just unexplainable, it's undeniable. And then something happened. About 300 years after the Way started with their sort of messy, kind of communal, kind of get together when we can, have something to eat kind of deal. About 300 years later, a Roman emperor by the name of Constantine did something that changed the face of church. He legalized freedom of religion, actually, for anybody. And then a few years later, he became a Christian himself. Suddenly, this marginalized group who had nowhere to meet and were kind of hiding, were kind of persecuted, and were meeting illegally, suddenly they became legal. And not only did they become legal, but because the emperor was into it, they now became trendy. It was now trendy to follow the Way, when it didn't used to be. Now it was trendy because Constantine was doing it. And all sorts of influential people flooded in, and there were conversions all over the place. And the whole of the Roman Empire, before long, within 10 short years, converts to Christianity. Wow! Converts to the Way. That's kind of amazing until you realize something. And we go back to Matthew 16, verse 18. Now I say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. What is church? It's a really good question if you're into church. If you're one of those people that put your hand up and say you love church, I don't know if you've asked yourself this question: what is church? Well, you've probably heard this word before. The word is ekklesia. It's the Greek word for church. And ekklesia, actually, the interesting thing about this word ekklesia is that it's not a religious word. It's just a word that means gathering people for a purpose. You can gather a whole bunch of politicians for a purpose. You can gather military people for military purposes. You can gather anybody. But this word ekklesia simply means a gathering. And the point of this gathering is that it is gathering for a purpose. So, when the Bible translators put into Matthew chapter 16, and they put these words, because mostly in your Bibles, what we're reading is word-for-word translations from Greek into English. But in this case, I mean, why didn't they just put, now I say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my gathering, and all the powers of hell will not conquer this gathering. And if you're asking, well, why didn't they just use gathering? That's a really good question, the answer to which might enlighten us as to why church is the way that we do church today. Well, when Constantine became a Christian, here's something that all the trendy people noticed. Notice that the people who were originally in the Way didn't have a lot of ornate services. And Constantine, being pagan, and pagan simply means someone who worships a multiple number of gods, who converted to Christianity, which worships one God. Even though they converted, they brought some of their ways with them. And so you couldn't really have processions and robes and ornaments and stuff in people's homes who were just kind of around there having lunch. And so what Constantine did is he made it possible for people to build basilicas, which is the Latin word for big buildings where you can worship God, basilicas. And so all these basilicas were going up. They noticed that people of the way would often gather around a martyr's grave, someone who had died for the way, had been persecuted and died, and whatever had happened to them, had become a martyr for Jesus Christ, and that these people who were in the way would often go around this martyr's grave, and they'd worship around this grave, and they'd praise God around the grave of martyrs. And so Constantine would see this, say, hey, let me build you a basilica so that you don't have to travel or you don't have to move too far, and people can see this basilica. It's not just word of mouth anymore. You can see this big basilica, and people will come, and everybody can come and worship in this basilica. And so they did that. And where there were places where you couldn't where you couldn't put a basilica over by the grave of a martyr, what they would do is they'd exhume the bones of the martyr, and they'd build a basilica in town, and they'd take the bones there, and you could worship in this basilica. Well, as the German culture became more prevalent within the kingdom, the Germans had a word for basilica, and their word for basilica was Kirika. And so they're calling these buildings Kirika. And then as modern German language came more into the fore, the word changed from Kirika to Kirk, this word Kirk, which is where we get our word church. The problem is that when Jesus talked about ecclesia, this gathering of people for a purpose, ecclesia and Kirika, and ecclesia and Kirk have very different meanings. And the meaning that we read in our Bible, when we look at church, the emphasis behind this meaning is not a movement, but the emphasis behind that meaning is a location. See, Jesus' church, ecclesia, was all about movement, was all about continuing to move and continuing to grow and continuing to reach. Whereas the word that we have for church today, and the word that we understand it to be, is this word Kirk, which has a totally different meaning, which is really all about the location. What does this mean for you and me, who have been called to form and shape the 21st century ecclesia of Jesus? It may mean that we need to continually look around our kirks and ask ourselves some pretty sobering questions. Questions like, are we moving or are we simply meeting? Questions like, are we making a difference in our local communities? Questions like, are we organized around a mission, or are we organized around a model? Do we spend more energy and time thinking about people, or do we spend more energy and time thinking about buildings? Are we ecclesia, or have we settled for Kirk? As I was thinking about this, I just come up with a demonstration. You see, we've been stuck with a Constantine model of church for probably around 1,300 years. And the Constantine model of church is like this, and I was familiar with this model. At the top here, you have a pastor, and then maybe below him, you'd have a management team of some sort, or a staff team, and below them, you'd have the congregation. This is Constantine's model of Kirk, Constantine's model of church, which we've kind of been doing for around 1,300 years. I think, having been at Papsda for a few years as being on staff, but also as a member here, part of the congregation, what I've seen happening at Papsda I think is quite fascinating. And I hope you will bear with me as I give you my opinion on what is happening here at Papsda. What I see happening here at Papsda is that we're doing this. We're doing this. And I'll tell you why I think we're doing this, because it's just what I see. We have our pastors, we have our management people, we have our elders, we have our staff team who are all about equipping you. You see, we're here, we want to equip you guys, we run programs like Equip. It's evident in the way that we do things, in the way that we speak. I don't know how great a job you think we're doing of that, but this is where our heart is. That we want to go, hey, I don't think that was really God's ideal. I think God's ideal was more like this. And you can tell because we say things like, everybody who is a follower of Jesus Christ is a pastor. So you can tell we kind of think like that. Once again, I don't know how well you think we're doing it, but this is what our heart is. You can tell because with our young people, we're continually pushing them to engage with community. I think we have wonderful, and I get the first-hand view of how gifted our young people are. And we kind of like wanting to do that. Invert Papsda's cone. Invert Constantine's cone and do this type of thing. And I love this. But I think there's an ecclesia model. And I think that we have a heart for ecclesia, but the ecclesia model looks like this, like that, I think, in my mind. Looks like this. And the first thing you notice about an ecclesia model is that this is all open. This is just open. The other thing you might notice about an ecclesia model is that it still needs leadership, right? But anybody can be in this position. The other thing that you notice about the ecclesia model is that it's closer to the street. It's closer to the street. I remember my first car, and I've talked about my first car a few times up here. It was a Morris Oxford, as you know. But what you may not know, and what I may not have told you about my Morris Oxford, is that it had no bolts on the seats. And it was a bit dodgy. And I think I've told you my story about Karen falling out of it. But the thing I used to love to do with this car is I'd get my mates and I'd say, hey, come on, let's go for a ride. With them not knowing that the seats weren't really kind of bolted down. And we'd cruise along, and I'm ready for this because I'm bracing. And as we got to the lights, I just jammed the brakes on. And of course, what would happen is they'd all end up in the front seat with me, and we'd have a good laugh. It was kind of really funny, you know. This is kind of, I think, what the ecclesia leadership model does. It kind of goes along, and then the leader jams on the brakes. Then all these guys here kind of find themselves with their faces pushed up against the front of the vehicle, and we just keep going. Here's the other great thing I think about ecclesia model. You see this model and this model I love, but the thing is, and we're going to have a look at Acts chapter 5 pretty soon so that you can understand what I'm talking about here. See, with this model, these wonderful things are happening, but they happen within our four walls of our church. They're wonderful, but they happen. With this model, this is open, and people are watching. It's just open. And when you read the book of Acts, what you find is that ecclesia was loving on each other. They were doing all their worship with each other. They were eating with each other. They were doing all these things in the full view of community. Everybody could see what was going on. Because it wasn't like this. It was like this. It was tipped over. It was like this. Everybody could see what was going on. And so Jesus had ecclesia at Zacchaeus' house. Everybody's watching. Now, here's the thing about ecclesia. There's a whole bunch of people that are watching, and as a matter of fact, what an ecclesia church says is they say, if you're watching, you're welcome to travel with us. You're welcome to cruise with us and keep watching what we're doing. And one day you might even want to join us. But the big thing is that for us as ecclesia is that you need to be able to see what we're doing. See, Jesus said, by this will all men know that you are my disciples if you love one another. But the only way that people can see that we love one another is if we tip this over and go ecclesia, so that whatever happens in our ecclesia, everybody around us can see. Have we got that Bible text, Acts chapter 5? Acts chapter 5, verse 12 to 14. Says this, check it out. The apostles were performing many miracles, signs and wonders among the people, and all the believers were meeting regularly at the temple in the area known as Solomon's Colonnade. But no one else dared to join them, even though all the people had high regard for them. You see what I'm talking about? Ecclesia does this. Everybody can see what we are doing as a church. But it's kind of the love is so freaky and the power is so freaky that everybody's watching. They're not joining yet. They're just going, boy, Wow, okay. But I'm going to follow these guys and I'm just going to keep following them. Whenever there's an ecclesia and I hear about it, I'm just going to go along. I'm going to watch. Because these guys are blowing me away. But I'm not going to join until we get to the next verse that says this. Yet more and more people believed and were brought to the Lord, crowds of both men and women. See, ecclesia opens our walls up. Ecclesia, we do this somehow so that people can see the love that's going on in here. We tip the model over and people can watch and they can see. Ecclesia is about tipping over the cone. So like I said, Jesus had ecclesia at Zacchaeus' house, everybody could see. Matthew, when he became a convert and became a follower of Jesus Christ, he threw a party and he invited everybody. And not everybody that came to that party joined Jesus in his mission, but they could see ecclesia at work. It was open for all to see. And when people see this ecclesia, something miraculous starts to take place. People on the outside who are following and watching what is happening on the inside get a glimpse of love and concern that they have never seen before. This thing called hope starts to percolate. Hope for a better world. Hope for a more just world. Hope. I remember going down to Papsda North, and I've asked Tracy if I could share the story. And we went down with 360 and performed Hikori Roa down there. Many of you may know Tracy's brother, Glenn. And I think it would be safe to say, Trace, that Glenn wouldn't regard himself as a follower of Jesus Christ. As a matter of fact, maybe whatever is, it's not that. But Glenn got to come out backstage. And what we do before we run our productions is we have like worship. We just worship. We just worship God, and we know that His Spirit is going to be with us, and it's a beautiful, awesome time of fellowship. After that meeting, Glenn had a chat to Tracy, and he said, look, words to these effects. Regardless of what I think about God, what I have just seen is something quite miraculous. You see, Glenn works in the social stream and works with lots and lots of young people who need something. And Glenn saw that there was something here. Glenn wasn't saying, I'm a believer now in Jesus Christ. He wasn't saying that. But he was looking on what was happening and he was saying, there is something special going on here. There's something special going on here. And he wrote us a letter and he sent an email. And he couldn't stop thinking about how something magic, something miraculous about the spirit that our young people have when they're worshiping God. You see, that's ecclesia. Open for people to see. Open for people who don't believe to see the love and the power of the Holy Spirit in our midst. I believe with all my heart that God is calling Papsda to the tipping point. I don't know what it looks like. I don't know how it plays out. But any kirk that has the courage to invert its model will at some time tip over into ecclesia. My challenge to you is, will you heed God's call to tip over into ecclesia when it happens? Because God doesn't speak to be heard, He speaks to be obeyed. Dallas Willard, a mighty, humble servant of God for many years, and awesome man, I had the privilege of hearing him speak one time, said this. This was the last statement he made before he died, his last public conference. He said, when you hear Jesus, do what He says. Don't build a theory, just do what He says, and reality will teach you. When God calls us to the tip, the question won't be how courageous we are. The question will be how surrendered we are. Can you see Papsda as an ecclesia? I can, and here's why. As staff, we often get emails, phone calls from visitors who say how welcome they feel when they come here. Are we starting to understand that we are all on the first impressions team, Jacinda? We're all on the first impressions team. I know we have one, but an ecclesia understands that we're all on the First Impressions team. As a body, we are becoming more and more accepting. We are becoming a hospital for the sick rather than a sanctuary for the saved. This is evident in our language, in our posture. We are learning to be compassionate without compromising. We believe in equipping believers for extending God's kingdom. We believe that all followers of Jesus are pastors. We are providing opportunities for our amazing young people to engage culture. We are valuing serving and justice over theological debate. We make decisions not by voting, but by unanimous decision, which is not always easy, but it means we fight for unity without demanding uniformity. We're getting a little messy. Our posture is that we'd rather make a difference than make a point. And as we move along this pathway from Kirk to ecclesia, we are realizing that sometimes things get gloriously messy, a little loose around the edges, but at the same time we are becoming more and more surrendered to God's red-hot passion for ecclesia. I want to conclude this morning with an excerpt from famous New Zealand poet Sarah Ryan from her piece entitled Radical Community. I want you to check this out. I've substituted words for church, Sarah, I hope you don't mind. There was once a place I called a community, filled with criminals, underdogs, and outcasts. But in this list was not the last. It was a vast expansion in which the blessed met the broken, the insecure and the outspoken, the audible and the deaf, those alive, those dead. And they loved each other with actions because words were unnecessary. Ecclesia. They not only wanted but needed this love so bad. We believed it to be a gift only we could have. So we built walls, and they were wide and tall. With pride, the cross on the steeple was erected. Wide doors which selected just who would be entered, but more so accepted into the stained glass community renamed a kirk. It became majestic and beautiful. It looked right in the center of the city, staring down. It stood, looking but dividing, and those refusing to enter multiplying, and the brick wall climbing until it reached the clouds, and they needed a rope just to get in. So the kirk installed alarm systems to feel safe from the outside. But the thought of safety from within was an illusion, a mirage, a delusion we had created inside the kirk, claiming that we are already saved. These walls, these bricks that were designed to keep us safe, have only put us deeper into this comfortable hole, slipping steeper into this castle we claim as only our home. And although it may be hard to see this idea transmitted into the setting, brings up the possibility that this could be the most dangerous place you could be, in which your love is conditional and selfish, forgetting the love which they had before, or simply choosing to ignore the fact that love is selfless. And that's what I believe the problem to be, refusing to realize, or just refusing to see how much time we spend weaving nets, but refuse to get wet, and don't practice but only preach about fishing. If we claim that the community is so important, why aren't we out there now? What if we stopped spending our money on security cameras, alarms and locks, and spent it on building concrete blocks to hold the doors wide right through the night, because it's in the dark we most need the light? What if we removed the desks from the offices and filled them with beds just to rest the heads of those spiritually dead? What if we tore down these walls, and I mean with a bulldozer, not with a bulldozer, but with our mind? When we are no longer blind, then perhaps we may be able to find this agape love we speak so fondly of. Our journey may begin from within the church, but our candle burns brightest in the dark. There was once a place I called ecclesia, filled with criminals, underdogs, and outcasts. But in this list was not the last. It was a vast expansion in which the blessed met the broken, the insecure and the outspoken, the audible and the deaf, those alive, those dead. And they loved each other with actions because words were unnecessary. And they chose to give this love away, but it still remained no matter how much they gave. And so this kirk we renamed Ecclesia, to show this radical idea that the community needs Ecclesia. But more importantly, Ecclesia needs the community. Can you see Papsda as an Ecclesia? I can. Can you imagine being in an Ecclesia? Can you imagine this happening not by might, not by power, but by God's Spirit? Can you imagine recapturing the ancient spirit of the first Ecclesia, who went out into the world with words like this ringing in their ears? I want to sing this song with you in closing. Really want you to feel God's call for this, His church, His Ecclesia. If you have a passion, a red-hot passion, the same as Jesus did, a passion for the church to be a place that not even the gates of hell can keep out. That's some power, isn't it? That is some power. To be a place that not even the gates of hell can keep out. Jesus was talking about Ecclesia, not kirk, Ecclesia. And I imagine when the first people went out and delivered this message about the event of the resurrection of Jesus, saying that somebody, listen, here's the message, Jesus has busted open. No, he smashed open the gates of hell. He smashed them open. And because he has busted them open, so can you. So can you. He's made it possible for the church to be able to bust open the gates of death. I imagine they would have said and sung words like this: